very important topic and one that's near and dear to all of our hearts, but I think we'll start by doing introductions. So Brian, do you mind starting?
Sure. I'm Brian Pfister. I'm the VP of Medical at Praxis Precision Medicines. PhD, background, neuroscience specialty, been doing this 25 years. But I also have a child who has epilepsy. So the reason for me to be here today is definitely, twofold, both professionally as well as personally.
Great. Kendall?
Hi everyone, I'm Kendall Davis. I'm the Director of Advocacy Strategy in the Center for Rare Diseases at ICON. We are a CRO, a contract research organization. Actually got my start in rare disease working for Global Genes, so this is really awesome to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, my focus for today is we work with a lot of companies who are getting into rare disease maybe for the first time and working with communities for the first time and understanding kind of the way that you can most appropriately collaborate and be really effective in your development of rare disease clinical research is ridiculously near and dear to my heart and my team, so happy to get to talk about it today.
Great, and I'm Christina Saninocencio, and I sort of wear a few different hats. I'm the founder of the Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation. I sort of transitioned over into academia a few years ago where I'm an assistant professor. And then I serve as a consultant for a number of different rare epilepsy organizations, and currently I have the role of vice chair of the Rare Epilepsy Network. But most importantly, I have a brother with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome who's 36. We just found his gene last year, which we're really excited about. And during my time with Lennox-Gastaut Foundation, I led the community through 3 clinical trials that received FDA approval. So I'm coming, again, from a few different hats here. So my first question is really directed to Brian. Brian is with Praxis, which is a company that's developing a medication for, and you can absolutely explain what Praxis is doing, but how do you think what do you think they've done really well in terms of using existing patient data to inform clinical trial design?
It's a great question. I love it because Praxis, we're working on 2 different drugs for SCN2A and 8A, as ASOs and small molecules as well. One of the things that we've done that we have not been able to do at other companies I've been at is really look at the amount of existing data about the patient profiles to understand how they exist. So in the past, I've worked on a lot of drugs, launched a lot of drugs, they've been successful, but we've had in the past failures where we said we didn't know what we didn't know. So what Praxis has done differently than other companies is we're looking at the data to say, how can we know everything about these patients? How can we understand, both clinical presentation and in real world presentation, what's meaningful to the families? So we've been able to partner with groups like Invitae and Behind the Seizure to get mountains of data about the patients, looking at the backgrounds, when they were diagnosed, the seizure onset, looking at the comorbid conditions and concomitant medications to get, I always kind of joke, it gets beyond the seizure. So we take behind the seizure data to get beyond the seizure when we look at endpoints for clinical trials. So what Praxis has done is spent way more hours than I ever thought we would looking at these data and looking at whether the clinical correlates are, looking at how the patients present, and then also then talking with families to understand how is this meaningful to you. So if you design a clinical trial, and you put it out there in the public and you can't enroll the trial, it comes back to the developer. Like, what did you do wrong in this situation? How do you not know your patient population well enough? We understand the disease itself or understand the condition itself, but a lot of times we kind of strip out all of the things that make the patient, and I think that's what I've seen in the past where companies have failed is not doing it. In Praxis, we're able to do it. And it's just, again, a lot of hours, to go through it and look at the analysis and really come up with what the conclusions are and how to run your clinical trial inclusion criteria against the real world information to say, here's the best study I've ever written, but I'm not going to enroll a single patient because they don't really exist that way. And so if we can fail first in that endeavor and modify the inclusion criteria to really get to the endpoints that we need, but while still having the scientific rigor and understand which are the most important exclusion criteria to ignore, and remove from the trial, then we can recruit these trials quicker, we can do better, we can model them, so we can run the study virtually, if you will, 6 or 7 times before we ever see it in the patient, ever have consent. We can look at all of this information to look at what does this actually look like and what's the likelihood of success.
Yeah. Kendall, do you have anything to add just about capturing the patient voice in this process?
Yeah, I think, to your point, being able to look at data that exists, if you have like a really rich natural history study, that can absolutely help you identify endpoints or look at the appropriate study population. But to kind of a point you were making a little bit later, like when we're talking about actually building a clinical trial, like we as an industry are really good at developing and building and designing a protocol that is going to get us the data that we need, right? But that data doesn't exist in the vacuum. That would be really wonderful, right? In clinical research, like we're talking about real people. And so actually having those conversations and thinking about what endpoints are actually going to be meaningful, but also how are you going to make this trial really accessible? You can design the perfect trial, but if, if it's not what, a patient is hoping to get out of it, or if it's not what they're looking to target, like you may not enroll, or if you can't provide travel support or really look at what an individual or a community is going to need to be able to participate and engage in that trial, like you're kind of setting your company up for failure. So taking it a step further and saying, great, if we have this existing data, let's look at it, let's see what we can pull out of it to design endpoints that are going to actually be meaningful. But take it a step further and say, okay, so now we know what we need to get from a data perspective. Now, how do we do that in a way that's actually going to be manageable and not introduce like a ridiculous level of burden onto, a person's everyday life?
And how can patient advocacy groups empower their communities to provide, different types of data, whether that is enrolling in a natural history study or, signing up for different types of research opportunities?
I mean, so this is such an important question, and so I think it kind of comes back to, it really depends on where your organization is. Organizations that might be more nascent and are starting out, really understanding the right types of information and data to collect, and working with organizations maybe like CORDS or RAREX, or even reaching out to an organization that has a really fantastic established registry. Maybe you have a clinician that's starting a natural history study or has an existing one, but working with the right type of data collection is imperative, because you don't want to get to a point where you've been working with your community to collect a bunch of data that's not necessarily going to be usable or transferable in clinical research. But then also really being conscious of the fact that it is really burdensome to ask individuals to constantly be putting information into these registries, these databases, natural history studies over and over. So figuring out what kind of support your community needs to be able to actually do that. So do they understand how to actually input the information? Like, would it be easier, if a clinician is able to conduct a survey and collect some of that information at a visit? Like, what is going to be the best way to get that information without constantly having to kind of ask for it and have them put it in a bunch of different places?
Yeah, I've seen that where people have mentioned fatigue, right? Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, here we go. Here's another registry I have to be part of.
Yeah.
What I can't stress enough is the importance of prospective data. Mm-hmm. So if we can align as a community, and this is kind of pharma, patient advocacy groups, patients, if we can align as a community of what are the key variables to capture to help us to understand trajectory of either improvement or decline, to really then be able to move forward. What is the endpoint? What's the most important endpoint? How do I understand if the drug works? So if we can streamline that so we don't get to fatigue, or we get to where people are engaged in this, I think it's important. I think that the PAGs, the patient advocacy groups, have been, I enjoy working with them because I get an opportunity to go to them and say, is this bullshit or not, right? So I can say, this is what I think, and they say, yeah, you're not even in the ballpark, right? Wrong zip code, you're not even right country code, right? So it's okay, fine, fair enough. But all those things are helpful. So those defeats and those hurdles and those trip ups are actually really helpful, because I feel more confident as we progress through the development process that we're going to get closer than we ever have been before to really meaningful, I don't want to say cures, but meaningful interventions that are designed for the patient, where they are, to meet them where they are, and really encompass how do we pick up on these subtle changes. Because, for example, depending upon the degree to which the patient is impacted by the condition, there's certain endpoints we would use that were like, there's no way this isn't going to move. Like there's a floor effect or there's a ceiling effect, and there's no way it's going to move. And it doesn't mean that there's not meaningful change that occurs. We just have to understand the variability within the patient population, distill that down, and pick out then scales that will pick up on that variability. So all three of us, if we're in the trial, we all don't have to move on the same endpoint, but or part of the scale, but we need to have some movement so that it allows for variability of improvement and also for us to see that signal, which helps us to refine in the next phases of development. But the PAGs and patient advocacy groups being able to help the families know, is this something I'm even remotely interested in, right? Because sometimes it sounds great, and you're like, oh, I don't think so. Or like you mentioned with travel, it's like, I'd love to do it, but I can't get there. Like, is there something better? How do we improve upon that?
And something else, we talk a lot about surveys and natural history data and things like that, but one of the things that I've been working on are conceptual disease models. And so for those of you that are not familiar with these are sort of formal frameworks that are developed to help describe the symptoms of a specific disease, and it really touches a lot on the quality of life, the lived experience of the patients, and they're done through qualitative methods, interviews, focus groups, things like that, and essentially that data is compiled and put into what is called this disease concept model. And they're becoming more and more popular in rare diseases, so I just wanted to know if you had any experience looking at those or doing any type of exploration in that area, and how you think those.
Yeah, so I mean, we're still kind of gestalt of understanding what I know about historical development. I think those things are going to be wildly successful to help to conceptualize this differently than what we've seen in the past. And there's kind of this other component where when we develop protocols, we sometimes have an ego. Like if we've done this for a long time, we're like, I know everything about everything. It's like, well, no, you don't. You probably don't. So those models, I think, are helpful to break through that ceiling that people have and to be able to design better trials and look at better endpoints.
And it incorporates the patient voice from the very beginning.
Sure.
And I think that that's so important. So how else, and just in terms of incorporating the patient voice, what should sponsors really be thinking about? What should PAGs be thinking about in order to really make sure that the patient voice is accounted for from day one? Tough question.
That's a good question.
I actually don't think it's that tough of a question. I think that if sponsors are really thinking about this from day one, we get to work with really phenomenal companies that are asking these questions before the protocol is even fully baked. Like, I genuinely believe that you need to have a lot of conversations and interactions with patients and organizations prior to finalizing your protocol. Because if you don't, you're setting yourself up for amendments. If I'm wrong, if you have created a protocol and never had to have an amendment, please find me after. I'd love to talk to you. But I think that if you're having those conversations, even really early, and there's so much hesitance in our industry to have those really early conversations because you don't want to set expectations too high. You don't want to say something that, may be construed differently. But I think that we as an industry need to give, especially rare disease patient organization leadership, a lot more credit to know that we can have transparent and we can have really frank conversations about the reality of what we're doing. We want to talk to you at the beginning. We want to have these conversations. We want to make sure we're moving in the right direction, all knowing that it may not work out. We may never progress. We may not hit our endpoints. We may have a failed trial, but if you're not having those conversations early, you really are setting yourself up for a lot more time. You're going to be investing way more money than you need to. And it's kind of offensive. Why are you trying to create a clinical trial where you're going to ask a bunch of people to introduce an incredible level of burden and, inconvenience into their life for a while if you haven't even asked them what they need? What would be helpful? How can we support you in making this something that's manageable?
I totally agree with you, and I think I'll take off my researcher cap for a minute and put my dad cap on. The reality is the families know their kids better than anybody does. And so asking them and say, hey, what's meaningful? How is your function? What are these things? Because we look at a lot of scales that are used and validated and widely accepted and adopted by regulatory agencies, and they're great and they're fine. But the variability in certain conditions is such that the scales just miss the mark. But if you talk to the patient advocacy advocacy groups and you talk to the families and you do caregiver councils and all those type of things to say, tell me what's a day in the life. What does this mean? Because I may find something that's going to help you more so than what you thought. And there may be other things that we look at, hard clinical endpoints. In epilepsy, we talk about seizures, right? Because it's something that people notice. But there's other components like meaningful, attenuation to stimuli, right? And so my son, and again, probably too much information, but my son, we thought he wasn't going to talk. Right? So we're like, how do we do nonverbal communication? Well, we're going to teach him sign language, right? Because he was just delayed, and we're like, there's something wrong. And so you talk to the epileptologist because he had a couple febrile seizures. You're like, oh, he's fine, don't worry, just wait. I'm like, well, I'm not going to wait. Like, I just don't feel like we should wait. And so then having the ability to say, I want a 24-hour EEG, and knowing that you're not out of your mind is very empowering. And so we picked up on what I thought was happening, but it was like 4:30 in the morning. 9 times out of 10, we're asleep at 4:30 in the morning. We're not going to see that. But we saw it only because we did this 24-hour video EEG in the ICU. And so like, okay, start treatment, let's go, let's wait. And so then, or not wait, let's go. And what we saw is as that changed, as we controlled the seizure activity, then we saw the verbal and language acquisition. So receptive language was great, but the expressive was just trash for a while. So he's come around, he's done much better, but it's that type of thing where the parent knows. The neurologist, and I love them dearly, I've worked with them, quarter of a century. They're great, but in that time period, they may miss those subtleties. Or as a parent, like you're kind of overwhelmed when you're in the office and you're like, oh, I forgot to tell them I saw this. And so then they don't pick up on those cues. So I think that the patient advocacy groups can really help from the community standpoint to say, here's what we're seeing, here's what's important to us. And to your point, Kendall, is like getting these endpoints that are really meaningful, not just clinically relevant.
Right. So I want to segue over to just the burden of clinical trials for patients. So let's start with this question. What is the process that Praxis is doing right now with the decentralized clinical trials, and how is that enticing or attractive to patients?
So we're super data. I'm a nerd, right? I will not be shy about saying it. But the data always informs of our next steps, our next decisions that we need to make. And so we're very data driven, very data heavy in that regard. When we did the analysis of behind the seizure data and we looked at what the comorbid conditions and concomitant medications that patients had and the sleep devices that they had to use and all the different things going on, it was clear to us these patients aren't going to travel. Like there's just, it's not realistic to ask them, and traveling from East Coast to West Coast yesterday, I'm like, phew, I didn't want to do it by myself, let alone if I had to take my children. And so we looked at it and said, is there a way that we could do decentralized clinical trial? So what does that mean for the family is you do it at home. We come to you, we send a neurologist, we send a nurse. So when you look at a lot of the PKs, the serial PK for pharmacokinetics, is we're gonna take blood from you every 2 hours for 12 hours. Is that realistic for these kids to be sitting in those clinics and doing that? And the answer is no. And so we talked to families and they said, we'd love to be part of this and we feel like the molecules are good, but we just cannot. So we're like, okay, well, let's do it. And people said, nobody's done it before. What do you do? I said, well, we're going to figure it out. So we had a group of people on the team, like literally spend every day for months to figure out how to do this. Can we find a vendor? How do we do this? How do we get over HIPAA? How do we make sure all these things are taken care of? And so now we have offered to our clinical trial participants, you can do it at home. They come to you, do the blood draws, do the neuro exams, do the drug accountability, do the administration. Everything can be done at home and do the final assessments too. And so we feel like that's a huge step forward, because what that's going to do is if we can enroll the clinical trials and get to a yes/no answer on the product quicker, then we can either move forward the molecule behind it. If it's a no, if this one didn't work, we move forward the next one. We can get to better medications more quickly, and the families can get a better understanding of, is this something they want to do? Because again, we heard a lot, I would love to do this, I just cannot. It's not that I don't want to, I just physically cannot go through that burden of travel. So.
Right. And Kendall, what about your experience? What do you think can help ease burden for families and patients?
Yeah, I mean, decentralized trials or any type of adaptive design, I think it's imperative at this point. Like we've seen that it works, we've seen that we can do it. I think being very cognizant of really the community that you're working with, what their travel preferences are, whether they can or cannot. Some individuals do actually want to get into a clinic because it might be the only time that they're really seeing a physician that might be a leader in the space. And so just understanding what that landscape of the population looks like and offering the option to have as much done at home as possible. I mean, it's amazing. It's really transformed the way that we're able to offer clinical research to patients. I think, again, I can't encourage companies enough to really think about the type of support that they're offering. There are companies that will offer like reimbursement for travel, but some people can't put that money up front. So maybe working with a service to actually get all of that taken care of so that an individual is literally getting picked up at their house, taken to the airport, they're picked up at the airport, to just kind of take some of that burden and thought out of the whole process. Like, what can we be doing to just make this easier? We also really encourage companies to think about doing like a day of run through. So prior to initiating and having your first patient in, have someone on your team, your advocacy function, maybe working with a patient organization, actually go to the clinical trial site and walk through the day like a patient is going to, because there's so many things that can happen at the site on the day of when you're there for your visit. You might be waiting 4 hours for a phlebotomy test. Like, that's awful, if you've had patients travel in. So actually walk through, see what it's going to be like for a patient to go through this process for the day that they're going to be in clinic, and see if there are areas where you can alleviate some of that. Can you, call ahead to make sure that things are set up? Can you condense and have, different visits, done at one time? Or can you, have them done at home? And so you're not bringing someone to a clinic every 8 weeks or whatever, the frequency is. But just really looking at, what are we asking people to do? What is this actually going to look like, when you lay it over their daily life? How is it going to impact the other people in the family? How can we support that? For individuals who are, bringing their kiddos, can you offer support for a second caregiver so that the first caregiver can go to the bathroom when they need to at the airport and not be stressed out about traveling with their child by themselves? Or, with their person they're caring for, like, can you just offer this extra bit of support so that you can alleviate some of that burden of participating? It can make a lot of difference, I think, for people who are, giving a lot of their time and energy to participate in your trials.
And then the last area I wanted to talk about is just this overall theme of collaboration. So I know you collaborate with a lot of different groups. So can you just walk me through, like, what does a really strong collaboration look like?
Yeah, we do. I am really fortunate. Our team, we get to work with some awesome organizations and companies. Like, there's just some really awesome, biotech and pharmaceutical companies in rare disease right now that we get to work with. I mean, it's really a communication thing. It's nothing new. It's nothing you guys haven't heard for the past 2 days. I think transparency is huge. I think that we as an industry get really, really uncomfortable with how we want to talk to patients and patient organizations about what we're doing, and for good reason. Like, the integrity of our trials and of what we're doing it's paramount, right? Because we want things to get to market. We want to bring drugs to communities as quickly as possible. But there are ways to have conversations and to communicate and to start building foundational relationships in a really meaningful way. And I think you have to do it early. If you don't, I think there's definitely ways to come in, but just, start building that foundation as quickly as you can. Be very clear about what you're going to be asking organizations to do. Like, if you're interested and you need help recruiting for a trial, like, let's not skirt around that. We all know that's what we're doing here, right? Like, that's a big part of the reason that companies need to work with patient organizations. But there's a symbiotic relationship there. There's a lot that organizations can also gain from working with biotech and pharmaceutical companies. And so I think having really clear and just as honest of a conversation as you can about what that looks like, and it's not always easy, but our team, sorry, I keep hitting my microphone. We love to facilitate some of these. We're here to really help. We want to help organizations understand how to have effective conversations with companies and vice versa, because we want this to happen as seamlessly as possible. And I think a lot of younger organizations, or even, patient groups that just haven't had a lot of experience with research, don't really know how to facilitate some of these conversations. They don't know what to ask for. They don't really know what they can and can't do. And so we want to offer that kind of support, because the more literate they are in how to engage with clinical research, the better the relationship's going to be with the company. And we're just going to move things, along a lot quicker.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say the transparency piece. Like be honest. Like say, hey, look, we're running into this problem. Can you help us solve it?
Right.
So it's the collective problem solving of the community, and that even means then sharing experiences with other pharma, folk too. Say, hey, we did this. Didn't work out so well, but we did it. You could try it if you want. Or saying, hey, this was awesome. This was phenomenal. I highly recommend it. Because competition is good because it pushes us all to be better and to do it faster, and all the things that we've taken advantage of in the country that we are. I think that just sharing what you've done and being looking at the greater good that's happening and being part of that community, and then understanding there's going to be times I'm going to have to come to you with a no, like I can't do it, it's not going to work, and that's okay, but you'll know it. It's going to be transparent and open and honest, and we've seen that with the patient advocate groups, like working with them and saying, here's what we're up against. Can we do this? And again, sometimes the answer is no. Like it's not going to work for molecule reasons, whatever the case is. But just being okay with that, and having that trust in one another that, hey, you'll tell me when I'm chopping on the wrong side of the branch, right? This isn't a good idea. And I then appreciate that, and then you just create that openness.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too, just asking organizations kind of what they need. I mean, I think a lot of times we run into, your patient organization might have a lot of experience talking about clinical research, but when you get kind of down to the level of just the community members, there's a lot of unknowns and people don't understand it. It's scary. There's, a ton of lingo that's just really confusing. And so making sure that, as sponsors, you're supporting what the community members need. So if there's a higher level of need of education around clinical drug development, support that if you can. There's some really fantastic resources, organizations. I love doing, drug development 101 for any organization. This is something we try to do as often as we can, but just making sure that you really understand what the base level needs are, because the needs of the patient organization may look very different than the needs of the actual patient community when it comes to what they need to know and what they need from a support perspective when it comes to clinical research. And I think it's, the responsibility of the sponsor to ask and to make sure that we're providing the right type of support, so that patients are empowered to decide whether or not they're going to participate in clinical trials. And if they are going to do that, that they do so in a way where they feel like they know what they're getting themselves into.
And speaking of resources, I know you have been working on this assessment tool.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I was actually here at Global Genes, and through a conversation actually with Melissa Hogan and then some subsequent conversations, I had joined PRA, which is now ICON, and we were talking about just this idea that it's really challenging to help companies just understand the level of burden that their protocols are placing on patients. And what if we could create something that would help them very quickly identify really specific areas of burden within a protocol or a clinical concept plan. So we created a tool, and when I say we, I mean my colleague over here, Laura Iliescu, that essentially allows companies to put different dimensions and aspects of a protocol through a very, very easy to use, it's in an Excel format, but it's a tool that basically asks you a bunch of questions about your protocol, and it provides a level of burden and risk to your program based on how you answer it. But it also provides you mitigation strategies. So if you have, it might ask you about your inclusion-exclusion criteria, and based on your answer, it could give you a level of risk to potentially enrolling your trial, but it will also provide you with hey, this is how you could potentially fix this. It takes about half an hour usually, so it's a pretty quick process, but it gives companies a really great just kind of bird's eye view of where the burden lies within their design and how they might be able to reduce some of that. It's completely open source and free. Any company can download it, rebrand it, use it for whatever you want. Like, it's really meant just to be a tool to kind of help you identify some quick areas that you may want to consider, because they could be very problematic. Another part of that tool is actually built for patient organizations, and it is it's essentially a list of questions like, what do you need to know? What can you ask? What should you be asking when you're thinking about participating in clinical research? So it's meant to provide just some really quick context around what you might actually be getting into and what you should be thinking about and asking if you want to participate in a study. There's a couple other components to it, and I have some handouts if anyone's interested. But it's a great tool to just kind of identify different things that might be of interest to a community that's maybe newer to research. As a team, we also offer office hours. So once a month or so, we have any patient organization can log in and talk to the Center for Rare Diseases at PRA. So it's myself and my 3 colleagues in advocacy, along with a couple of our therapeutic experts. So if you just have questions about clinical research or really anything related to drug development, we're trying to offer as much support as we can. Or if your organization or company needs some more one-on-one specific consultation, we do that as well. But really just however we can be providing as much education and information around clinical drug development, we're trying to create tools to do so.
Excellent. Well, I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A, but I think we'll wrap up by I'm going to ask you each, what is one, I guess, takeaway or the biggest takeaway you want everybody in the room to know just about clinical trial or becoming clinical trial ready?
So I think this is an important one. Be bold, right? So when you look at this, there's a better way of doing it. Like having done this for a long, long time, you kind of see the formulas pop up and they kind of do it the same way. Be bold. Like, it's meaningful to these families. It's meaningful to these kids. It's meaningful to these communities much more than we realize sometimes. So be bold, take risks. Don't obviously drive the program into a ditch necessarily, but be bold. Like, even though there's not a roadmap to do DCT, we're doing DCT. There's no direct, follow this path and you're successful. Do it anyway, because it is so incredibly meaningful. Be bold.
I would say, data is so incredibly important, and so make sure no matter how you're collecting it, you're doing it in a way that's really going to be helpful and usable. Again, there's a lot of fantastic resources. Talk to Ben back there from CORDS, anybody from RareX, but there's some great natural history and registry support out there. But make sure that you're doing it in a way that's meaningful. And also, as an organization, figure out what your community really needs to make sure that they can be contributing to these data sets. Because again, it is just really hard. It's so hard to ask your community members to put their information into yet another survey or registry. So be really thoughtful about that, because it's so valuable, and even if it's not right now, it will be. And I think the more that we can help patients and families and everybody understand the value and why it's just so important to keep doing that, and the more that we can support them in that data collection, I think the better we will be as an industry. And then again, just have open, transparent conversations with the communities that you're willing to work with. Every patient community I've ever worked with is so willing to do, whatever they can to assist in clinical drug development. But just because they're willing does not mean they should be taken advantage of by industry.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both so much for this great discussion. We have 8 minutes and 48 seconds left, so I think we'll open it up now to Q&A. See.
This is just a quick question, I think. So I come from a very rural part of America, and I thought that the discussion about accommodating patients who need help getting to a place where a trial is offered is really great. I want to hear what you think about the opposite, where we can incorporate things like telemedicine, where we can incorporate things like using critical access hospitals as clinical trial sites instead of having the patients go to the academic research center. What can sponsors do to bring something like an infusion to a critical access hospital and have the patient simply go down the road?
Yeah, so that's actually, it's interesting because we have, as I mentioned, both small molecules and ASOs, so antisense oligonucleotides, they're delivered intrathecally, right? Lumbar puncture sort of delivery. And that's a very real question because there's a ton of patients who would love to participate, but they're not going to drive 6 hours. And this was what the family told me. They said it's 6 hours to drive in Nebraska. But they we want to do it. I'm like, oh my gosh, bless your heart. So that's something we're looking at is how do we take it to the next level? Small molecule is easier, right? Because I can ship it to you, I can have somebody deliver it to you. Intrathecal injections are more challenging, but not impossible, right? And so then that becomes, do you set up the main center and then satellite center? Basically you're renting the time at the facility. And so I think there's a possibility, and that's where then we look at, is there a vendor that can help me do that? Is there somebody who can help me with the contracting process to get it, maintained, to make sure it's audit ready, make sure everything is above board, that there's no patient safety, because above all else, like we talk about drug development, patient safety is the first and foremost. If it's going to have an element of risk of safety whatsoever, I wouldn't do it. But if I can do it successfully and safely, yeah, the sky's the limit. And that's kind of the thing that we're looking into, because we'll have a lot more of these coming through, from our end. So it's a question we're dealing with right now.
I would also encourage, you bring us into something I think we could talk about for another 45 minutes, but you want to talk about increasing the diversity within your clinical trial. You actually have to think about where people live within the country. So I really encourage all the time companies to think about training research naive sites, going to the places where these patients actually are, getting into the community level hospitals and looking at what can be done to kind of expand our actual site network. Because a lot of times we're tapping into the same sites in academic centers or large cities where, again, travel might be an issue, or these centers may have too much going on. They might not even be able to take on your trial. And so we really encourage companies to think a little bit broader. And it's a huge upfront investment, right? It's hard to do this kind of thing. But I think if we're really trying to dig deep and access the community and provide the same level of access to a clinical trial to as many people as possible, we have to think about these things, and we have to be willing to get a bit creative about where our sites are and how we're offering the trial to the community.
And you mentioned something, the inclusivity, right? By changing the trial model to create more diversity and inclusivity. We had patients, when looking through the data, we had patients who were excluded for the mere fact that they presented, with a much more severe phenotype. And I'm like, wait, these are the patients who need this the most, and these are the ones we're excluding. I'm like, this makes no sense.
Right.
So you can open up that inclusivity and get a more diverse patient population, which is what regulatory bodies want. Show me this works across the board, and these are generalizable. And that's where the innovative component, you go from pontification to innovation. We've talked about it for decades. Well, just do it, and we'll figure it out. So.
From this perspective, including indigenous populations in particular, these sorts of strategies are incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, my name is Kevin Fried. I'm from Salem Oaks, and we build bite-sized education around drug development and research process for organizations. And we did one for the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, specifically teaching 20 of their community members how to review a clinical trial protocol and create actionable feedback for you. So I want to ask you, what's the difference in impact you see when you go to a knowledgeable patient organization versus one that's kind of just asking for the world?
I mean, I can say that you're going to get very different types of feedback. Like if you're talking, so that's amazing, by the way, and Sangamo's doing some really cool stuff, so thank you for all you're doing. But you're going to get really different levels of feedback. I think if you're talking to someone who may not be as research literate, you're going to get some very like straightforward logistical feedback about how not accessible your protocol might be. So you're going to get a level of, insight that might be very practical. Whereas if you're talking to someone who, has experience reviewing a protocol, you might get some really granular level insight. So I would love to see all of these, insights being gathered when you're thinking about building or when you're doing your protocol concepts, but you're just gonna get very different levels of insight, but it's all really valuable, and it, I think, will net out providing the same level of benefit. Do you?
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Good answer. Yep.
From a patient advocacy standpoint, how can we know if there's a company that's in early stages with a drug that could benefit our community, so we can start the collaboration and conversations early, gather the right data for them, and so on? Is there somewhere we can go to find that information?
That's a great question. I don't know. I can tell you, so a lot of times, like our team, we learn very early when companies are in a space, and we encourage really quickly, like, all right, let's find out where the patient organizations are and talk to them. I don't know. Do you know if there's like a great
central place? But I would hope that the organization would be approaching you right away from the beginning. But if they're not, then.
Yeah, so we hire a crack team of experts that do that. So Ross, I don't know if he's in the room, but Ross in the back is actually, that is his primary goal, is to liaise with the PAGs to make sure that they're aware of what we've got coming up, and in doing it well in advance of like, hey, here's a study, what do we do? Let's talk about what are the needs, because all of that data for me is just so important. Okay, here's what we're dealing with, here's what the challenges are, here's what the families tell us, here's what the PAGs need, and we've dedicated that, and that's been something I think in the last 10 to 15 years has picked up pace in the industry, where they see the value. Like, we need to know like the organizations and what challenges they have. So we dedicate resources.
Well, and I'd say, I would love to meet you, because like a huge part of the function of my team is to kind of know what organizations are out there and what communities are forming and all of that, so that when companies come to us or when we learn about this, we're able to say, okay, hey, we have some contacts over here. So, I'd love to meet with you after this to just at least get on your radar.
Well, we are pretty much out of time, so thank you very much to both of you for a great discussion, and thank you everybody for being here today.